In 1912, the world was a powder keg disguised as a ballroom. We like to remember the era as a sepia-toned dream of lace, top hats, and slow-moving carriages. We see the Titanic as a freak accident, a tragic collision between a mountain of ice and a masterpiece of steel. But that is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. The Titanic didn't just sink because of an iceberg. It sank because the world it was built in was already drowning. Before the first drop of North Atlantic seawater ever touched its hull, these foundations of the 20th century were screaming under the weight of a society that had lost its mind. To understand the disaster, you have to stop looking at the ship and start looking at the shadows it cast over the people who built it. You see, the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was a 46,000-ton psychological experiment. It was a floating hierarchy, a microcosm of a world where your proximity to the boiler room or the ballroom determined whether you were a human being or a piece of expendable machinery. Imagine standing on the docks of Southampton. The air is thick with the smell of sulfur and the sweat of thousands. You look up at this wall of black iron and you see progress. You see a god made of rivets. But if you look closer at the faces of the men watching from the shoreline, you don't see pride. You see exhaustion. You see a civilization that had been pushed to the absolute limit. For decades, the Industrial Revolution had been a hungry god. It demanded more. Coal, more speed, more blood. The elite were intoxicated by the fumes of their own success. They believed they had finally conquered nature, conquered poverty, and conquered God himself. They called it the Gilded Age. But gold is just a thin layer of beauty used to hide the rot of the lead underneath. The world was cracking, and the Titanic was the loudest snap of all. By 1912, the psychological divide between the top 1% and the bottom 99 wasn't just a gap, it was a canyon. In London and New York, the ultra-wealthy lived in a state of sensory overload. Their lives were a blur of fine silk, 12-course meals, and the newfound magic of electricity. They were the architects of a new world, a world where distance was being murdered by the steam engine and the telegram. They felt invincible, and that invincibility created a very specific kind of madness, the madness of the unsinkable. But while J.P. Morgan and the Astors were calculating their compounding interest, the streets beneath their balconies were a different reality. The Industrial Revolution had turned the human body into an extension of the factory. In the shadows of the great ship's construction, families lived 10 to a room. Children worked 14-hour shifts in textile mills until their lungs were coated in lint. The pressure was mounting. The currency of the era was burning faster than winter wood, but the heat was only being felt at the top. The workers were becoming restless. Strikes were paralyzing the coal mines. The suffragettes were burning buildings for the right to exist in the political sphere. The psychological tension was thick enough to choke on. We often ask, how could they be so arrogant? How could they ignore the warnings? The answer is simple. When you are at the top of a world that has never told you no, you begin to believe that the laws of physics are merely suggestions. The elite of 1912 didn't just want a ship. They wanted a monument to their own ego. They wanted a palace that could defy the ocean. They were obsessed with size because they were terrified of their own insignificance in a rapidly changing world. Think about the psychology of the Black Gang. That's what they called the stokers who lived in the bowels of the Titanic. Hundreds of feet below the crystal chandeliers of the first-class dining saloon, these men lived in a literal hell. They were covered in soot from head to toe, shoveling 16 tons of coal an hour into the white-hot maws of the furnaces. They were the engine of the world, yet they were invisible. In the design of the ship, the architects ensured that a first-class passenger would never have to lay eyes on a stoker. Their paths were physically engineered to never cross. This wasn't just about convenience, it was a psychological wall. If the rich could ignore the source of their power, they could ignore the fragility of their existence. But you can only ignore the pressure for so long before the pipes begin to burst. The Titanic was a pressure cooker of class resentment. The steerage passengers, the immigrants chasing the American dream, were locked behind gates. They were treated like biological hazards. To the elite, these people weren't just poor, they were a different species. This was the era of eugenics, the dark science. That suggested the poor were genetically inferior. When you look at the Titanic through this lens, the tragedy stops looking like a mistake and starts looking like a prophecy. As the ship steamed toward its destiny, the world around it was already on the brink of a much larger disaster. The Great War was only 2 years away. The monarchies of Europe were crumbling. The old order was dying, and it was, clinging to its dignity with bloodied fingernails. The Titanic was the last great celebration of that old order. It was the last dinner of the Edwardian era. On the night of April 14th, the water was unnaturally calm. It was a flat calm, a mirror that reflected the stars so perfectly that the horizon vanished. It was a psychological trap, without the breaking of waves against an iceberg's base. The lookouts were blind. But why were they going so fast through a known ice field? Why did the captain ignore 7 consecutive warnings? Because speed was the only metric of success. The world demanded faster. The investors demanded faster. The ego of the era demanded that the unsinkable prove its dominance over the elements. The iceberg didn't just hit the ship, it hit a society that was too stiff to bend. The collision was subtle at first, a slight jar, a grinding sound that many first-class passengers dismissed as a minor mechanical hiccup. They went back to their scotch and their card games. They believed the marketing. They believed that even if the ship was damaged, it would stay afloat for days. But down in the boiler rooms, the reality hit instantly. The sea didn't care about social status. It didn't care about the price of a ticket. The water rushed in, cold and indifferent, drowning the men who had spent their lives, keeping the fires burning. This is where the psychological horror of the broken world truly reveals itself. As the bow began to dip, the class system didn't dissolve. It solidified. The gates stayed locked. The women and children first rule was applied, but with a horrifying asterisk. A child in first class was more likely to survive than a grown man in third, but a child in third class was less likely to survive than a dog in first. But we often forget the terror of those, trapped in the maze of the lower decks, watching the water rise in the dark, knowing they had been forgotten by the world above. The Titanic didn't just sink, it exposed the structural failure of human empathy. When the ship finally broke in two and vanished into the 2-mile abyss, it took more than 1,500 souls with it. But it also took the illusion of the Gilded Age. The world woke up on April 15, 1912, and realized that their machines could not save them. Their money could not save them. Their superiority was a ghost. The disaster was a dress rehearsal for the 20th century. 2 years later, the same arrogance that ignored the icebergs would lead the world into the trenches of World War I. The same class divide that locked the gates on the Titanic would fuel the flames of the Russian Revolution. The broken world before the Titanic was a world that had forgotten its own humanity in the pursuit of steel and gold. It was a world that prioritized the appearance of safety over the reality of it. Do we see the parallels today? We live in a world of high-speed progress, of unimaginable wealth sitting atop a foundation of invisible labor. We have our own unsinkable systems, our global economies, our digital infrastructures, our mastery over nature. We ignore the warnings because we believe we are too big to fail. We believe that the walls we build between us and them will protect us when the cold water starts to rise. But history is a circle, not a line. The Titanic remains at the bottom of the ocean, a rusted skeleton being slowly consumed by bacteria. It serves as a reminder that every civilization has its iceberg. It serves as a reminder that the cracks in society always appear long before the final collapse. The question isn't whether the world is breaking. The question is, are we listening to the groans of the hull? Or are we still in the ballroom, ordering another drink and telling ourselves that the ship is unsinkable? If you found this deep dive into the psychological history of the Titanic era thought-provoking, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We explore the shadows of history that others choose to ignore. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the full story of the Titanic, and leave a comment below. Do you think our modern world is heading for its own iceberg? Let's talk about it. Thanks for watching.